Now I'd like to invite speakers and moderators from panel 1 to move to the stage, and we're about to begin the panel 1 immediately. This panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Pao, who just came back from Asia very late last night, and thank you for being with us today.
Missing. Oh, there he comes, huh?
He's there.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Hong Nong, for organizing this session. It's a matter of considerable bravery to be taking on some of these topics in Washington at this time, and I come here with considerable trepidation that what we have to say has to be understood in its most complete context, and we have to understand that a lot of people will listen to what is said and take away very different points of view depending on where they start when you begin to speak. But when it comes to my being here, I want to give considerable respect to Hong Nong, who over years of cooperation in a variety of forums, when we've disagreed fundamentally and when we've agreed wholeheartedly, she's been utterly civilized, polite, patient, and it is in that light I've come to this session feeling confident that I'm making the right move today. Now, this hotel is a kind of you may not know this story, it's a kind of a symbol of development and culture clash. Shortly after the Civil War, the hotel was built, and it was Washington's best and newest product. And we had a new relationship with the Empire of Japan. And Japan sent its first diplomatic delegation to Washington. They stopped in New York for the diplomats to get properly made suits to look right when they showed up to present their credentials. But they also brought along some samurai, still wearing the Japanese kimono and carrying the katana, the sword. And they arrived in the lobby of this hotel and looked around, seemed nice. They signed their names, presented their papers. And then they were all ushered into a very small room. And the samurai were instantly feeling insulted and started reaching for their swords. But then the room started to move and completely surprised them because they'd never encountered an elevator before. And that was the first indication of how Japan and the U.S. were going to have to work their way through a lot of problems. Today we have something symbolically similar to that here in this hotel, and you ought to know the story. I'm joined by a very distinguished panel of specialists in a variety of fields. My colleague from the Carnegie Endowment, Michael Swain, has been working on security issues for decades. My former colleague in the Reagan administration, Abe Sofair, now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, is a great jurist, knowledgeable person in international law, and I think will bring important insights. Shunding Li, we've known each other so long from Fudan University, where he specializes in international relations. And then we've got from the U.S. China Business Council, where she serves as vice president, and has been a source of common sense and insight for many years now, despite the very young and fresh look that she brings to the podium today. So we're going to start with some remarks by each, and I'm going to be an activist moderator. And so I look forward to joining in a discussion with you, and then we'll open the floor toward the end to all of you here. Michael, you want to give us some opening remarks?
Do you want to?
Wherever you
shall
want.
I use? Thank you, Doug. And thanks to Nong Hong and to Wu Zhichun and everyone else for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I share Doug's sentiment about the need to have these kinds of gatherings. I think ICAS has played a very positive role in many ways in trying to continue to encourage dialogue between the United States and China in a variety of ways. Unfortunately, I'm not here to give you a whole lot of good news today. I agree with others who've said the U.S.-China relationship is in its most severe challenge today than it has ever been since the inception of the U.S.-China Normalization Agreement in the early 1970s. A highly corrosive dynamic has really emerged in both the United States and in China, but especially in the United States, that increasingly applies worst-case assumptions and zero-sum solutions to virtually all areas of real and imagined contention between the two countries, while at the same time downplaying areas of cooperation and areas of mutual understanding. On the U.S. side, lacking largely any conclusive evidence for what are really, in my view, overblown categorical condemnations, the Trump administration, its supporters, and some individual scholars or analysts seek to buttress their very extreme views with arm-waving references to the general history of rising powers, realpolitik theories of anarchic struggle among power-centered or power-maximizing states, or assumptions about foreign policy based on certain domestic features of each country, politically and socially. Ignoring the obvious benefits accruing from the balanced U.S.-China policy of the past, the Trump administration, many Republican and Democratic members of Congress, and some China experts have endorsed a highly distorted narrative of a failed American policy of concession, weakness, and dashed expectations that has allegedly permitted Beijing to undermine U.S. interests at almost every turn. Although U.S. policymakers have certainly made their mistakes over the past 40 years or so, the history of U.S.-China relations since diplomatic ties were established really belies this distorted viewpoint. China and the U.S. have not always agreed, and they have sometimes sharply diverged, but they have nevertheless managed to work together to strengthen the regional and the global economy during difficult times, to apply pressure on aspiring nuclear weapons states such as Iran and North Korea, and to deal with the growing variety of transnational threats of various types. The ideal of a failed U.S. policy line provides a simple, seductive story for posturing politicians, ambitious former officials, and iconoclastic Trumpists looking for ways to blame America's ills on both the incompetence of past administrations and, of course, on the Chinese. While current U.S. policies, in my view, are most at fault for driving the current downward spiral in U.S.-China relations, Beijing, in my view, is far from blameless. In recent years, and especially under Xi Jinping, Chinese propaganda has become more hostile toward supposed foreign threats to domestic stability and prosperity. Chinese officials at many levels are now more assertive in cautioning the public about interactions with foreigners. The overall expansion of intrusive Chinese government surveillance within China is extending not just to Chinese, but to foreign businesses, NGO staff, and students. And Beijing is now resorting to what I regard as truly outrageous attempts to stifle domestic unrest in ethnic minority areas by placing hundreds of thousands of its own citizens in so-called education or re-education and training camps in violation of Chinese laws and processes. All of these actions contribute to the growing climate of suspicion and hostility in the relationship. The Chinese government only worsens the situation by denying the legitimacy of virtually all criticisms of its behavior while mouthing simplistic, self-serving slogans and platitudes, such as repeated references to China's peaceful intentions, its purely defensive-oriented security strategy, and its commitment to win-win outcomes with all nations. Such propagandistic emanations in many ways simply heighten U.S. suspicions and hyperbole and undercut the arguments of those seeking a more fact-based, pragmatic relationship. For me, in the security realm, the primary danger here is that this negative spiral, fueled by both sides, is going to increase the likelihood of crises, particularly in the Western Pacific, between the US and China. Crises driven by overconfidence in some respects on the Chinese side and an overreaction on the US side. I'm especially concerned about the possibility that the current dynamic could contribute to real crises in the South China Sea and Taiwan. China could decide that the provocations, as it sees it, of the United States require it to do certain things which will simply escalate the situation even further. On the US side, a view of Taiwan not as an entity whose political status ultimately is unresolved and which needs to be decided by both sides of the Taiwan Strait will be replaced by a concept in which Taiwan is viewed by the United States as a strategic asset that must be denied to China for larger geostrategic and security reasons. This kind of an approach could lead us towards real conflict between the US and China. I was recently at a conference at Tufts University and listened to someone from the United States who expressed views that would really put your hair on end in terms of what the United States should be doing vis-a-vis Taiwan. So, what's to be done in this situation? Well, I don't think that we are on the verge of conflict. I do think we're on the verge of a much more tumultuous and challenging relationship, and we need to be able to gain greater control over this situation. And the way to do this, in part, is by developing more effective ways to anticipate and manage crises. And this is something I've worked on for over a decade with people in China, and it's never been more needed than it is today. There needs to be a more important, more widespread, not just military, but civilian interaction between the United States and China to deal with the likely sources of crisis misperception and crisis escalation. There needs to be a common recognition that neither side can benefit from crisis. Both sides have a stake in limiting it. I've advocated, and my colleagues in this project have advocated, certain changes that could occur in both US and Chinese decision-making that would improve this situation. And I hope that occurs in the future. In addition to this, I think, as somebody mentioned, one area where we really need to focus attention is not just in political military crises, but on economic crises. And the possibility there that we could be in an economic crisis either provoked by the spiraling trade war between the US and China, and I don't believe that that is in any way over, or by larger factors that could occur on the global economic scene. We need to have greater communication and greater understanding about how to deal with these potential crises in order to anchor the relationship more effectively. More broadly, I think the US and China need to step back and start looking very seriously at the evolving power balance in Asia. Each side needs to develop goals and interests based on realistic assessments of changing relative military, economic, and political capabilities among the major powers. And neither should assume that it will dominate this vital region in the future. They need to define more clearly and credibly what red lines exist and how best to defend them, and where mutual reassurance is possible. And overall, I think they need to establish a stable balance, because if we don't do that, we're going to end up with a very unstable balance. Finally, I think there's a strong need for serious, prestigious figures on both sides to speak out clearly about the situation. Not just China specialists or people who have been connected with China for decades, but people who are taking the American and the US-China interest in mind, who have deep experience in various areas that could cause crises in the future, and who don't like the trends that we see underway today. I think there needs to be more of this occurring. Unfortunately, it's not happening that much, especially in Washington. But I think that will have to happen. I don't think we're going to see huge changes under current leadership, particularly in the United States. I think we're probably going to have to see a new U.S. administration come into power that has a more pragmatic understanding of the U.S.-China relationship, and we're going to have to see a more moderate leadership come into power, in my view, in China as well. This is not going to be a simple and easy process, but I think with the right kind of orientation and the right kind of motivation and outlook in dealing with our current situation, we can look to improved, if not ideal, situations in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. You finished on a note where you hope that a future administration will bring a more realistic view of China. I wish among the, I think now, as of this morning, 20 Democratic candidates to be nominated as President of the United States, none has so far seen a pragmatic approach to China as better than a hostile and conflictual approach to China. So we may have a long wait for that. I'd like now to turn to distinguished Professor Abe Sofair to speak to us. Thank you.
Sorry, was that about 10 minutes?
It's always, good morning and so good to see all of you. Does he sound all right? Yeah. I must say I congratulate Dr. Wu, Hong Nong, for the amazing progress you've made over the years here in establishing this excellent group and bringing together people with genuine experience and differing views, and listening to each other and learning from each other. Well, Michael always helps me out by giving the big picture, and I don't need to add anything to that. Also, Doug has pointed out that the toxicity of the relationship is so profound that it has nothing to do with really partisan politics right now. It's just very difficult to say anything constructive that's detailed and functional. As we're really grateful, in fact, that the trade negotiation is continuing and seems to be genuine and seriously addressed. So it would be great if other aspects of the relationship were being looked at with that kind of seriousness and detail. So I take the job of being the person who will put out my views about the South China Sea, knowing full well how unrealistic they are in the present context. But I spent 5 years in the State Department, and before that, as a district judge, I had many, many controversies before me, over and over again, massive ones, very complex ones. It took me 5 years to solve the dispute between Egypt and Israel over the last piece of the border between Egypt and Israel. And no one thought that I'd succeed. Maybe even I didn't think I'd succeed. But the fact is that if you stick with something and it makes sense to start with, you have a chance in the right circumstances to bring it about. George Shultz, my boss and my mentor, always used the analogy of a garden, that if you're working in foreign affairs, it's like being in a garden, and not everything blooms at the same time. But you do have to do a lot of caretaking in order to have anything bloom. So you work on things sometimes that don't seem to be practical today, but because they're important, and you know that someday they may be a time when someone will come out and say, oh, we need this kind of a flower, or we need that kind of a vegetable. And there it is. You properly planted and nourished that idea, and that idea can then be put to use. So it's with that, that kind of optimistic attitude that I've been addressing this issue of the South China Sea. I think it's a serious issue, the difficulties between China and the United States right now, and between China and other states, and the United States as well, have a lot to do with trade, commerce, and attitude. There are very few areas in which force is at the heart of the difference. And that's why the South China Sea issue is so important, because there something very important has happened. China has taken over a significant piece of the South China Sea, which China claims to be within the 9-dash line and therefore its own territory. It has done so with power, and it has gotten away with it, so to speak. I am not in any kind of camp that would suggest that some physical action should be taken with respect to that action by China. But it has not only taken control, it has built some 20 military-related places and brought in clearly potentially offensive weapons. That is a development that I think deserves specific continued attention. As any of you who have read my articles on this subject know, I opposed the tribunals taking jurisdiction over the Philippine claim. I opposed and thought it was very unwise that the Philippines would bring such a claim, knowing that the spirit of the reservations, if not the letter, made it inappropriate for that kind of a claim that has such significant impact on the sovereignty claims of China to be heard by a bunch of law professors. Since I'm a law professor, I can say that. Law professors have their place, but when you're trying to deal with a very complex issue of national security between two states, you absolutely need the commitment of those states to the process of adjudication if you wish to have practical consequences flow from that adjudication. So I have opposed that tribunal action, but at the same time, one must say that while China says, oh, we haven't changed the philosophy of Deng Xiaoping, we believe in the peaceful settlement of disputes. We believe that when two states have conflicting claims over an area, they should set them aside and work together to jointly develop or cooperate in that area. And only if the other state takes steps to assert its claim will we, China, assert our claim through the use of force. Well, one could argue that the Chinese government did need to make it very clear that they were not going to obey this tribunal ruling. Certainly, I agree with that. But they certainly did not need to develop a militarization process in that area. So I don't think that China can credibly can say that it continues to maintain the wise and effective, incidentally, wise and effective policy of Deng Xiaoping unless it finds a way to withdraw from that area and return it to the status of a disputed area between two sovereign states. And that is the ambitious goal that I have stated. but not because I think it's important, but because, as you'll see, the core of my presentation today, which I will sum up very quickly, is that it is very much in China's interest to withdraw from this disputed area. It's very much in the interest of the United States and other states to get involved and support China's withdrawal from that area, and at the same time support a process by which China could not be once again put in the position of having to consider doing the kind of thing that it felt it was required to do in the South China Sea. And finally, that it's very much in the interest of international law that the suggestions I made in Atlanta about a deal that could be worked out to bring about these objectives, those suggestions would serve the interests of international law. So let me say that why is this in the interests of China, this idea? Well, it's easy to say, don't be silly. China's not going to withdraw from this area. They control it. They've built 20-some military installations there. No one's going to push them out physically. Never happened. Well, I think that China does realize and is increasingly experiencing the reasons why it is very much in China's interest to consider this. First, the fact is that China's long-standing opposition to the use of force in response to international disputes is no longer credible. It has lost its neighbors' trust. Its influence within the region it considers its natural sphere of leadership has diminished. Its SCS actions have undermined its effort to reduce the U.S. presence in the SCS area by establishing a justification for increased U.S. military activity. I must say, Dr. Wu's point that he was concerned about increased U.S. military activity, increased naval construction, all the things that we're talking about, increased U.S. cooperation with other SCS claimants to put pressure on China, all these things are unfortunate developments. But if you look at it with any kind of objectivity, you'll see that these processes have been facilitated by China's action. China has exacerbated its own problems. It has given the United States a completely rational, good ground for increasing naval challenges, including the freedom of navigation exercises. Now, it's accurate to say that China's takeover of the SCS area gives China a certain territorial control, but this is not an unmitigated gain in any way whatsoever. States overwhelmingly disagree with China's claim to have sovereignty over the area, including the Philippines. The Philippines have been compelled to cooperate with China, but they retain their sovereign claims. They've put them aside, using, incidentally, interestingly, Deng Xiaoping's language in this regard. But they retain those, and there's going to be this continuing uncertainty about sovereignty. This issue is far from settled. China's militarization of the SCS had led the U.S. and some allies to engage in these FONOPs, and that has led China to launch risky challenges to those FONOPs. building, maintaining, and utilizing these bases that China has established in the SCS has been expensive and will become increasingly expensive at a time China has other pressing needs. And physical control is not everything in that area. Generally speaking, for resource development, for fishing management, for all the things you need in that kind of an area, you do need cooperation. You need other states to work with you and companies from other states. Finally, China faces the continuing risk that other competing SCS states will drink what I regard the same Kool-Aid that was swallowed by the Philippines and bring suits against China under UNCLOS. That remains a threat to China. And the proposal that I made in Atlanta, if you recall, would eliminate that threat because it would give China the ability to define itself the contours and meaning of the Article 495 reservations that it explicitly made a condition of its adoption of UNCLOS. So for these reasons, I believe China has indicated a willingness to talk about matters related to withdrawal or cooperation. It's worked with the Philippines. It's indicated a willingness to establish an international center in the disputed area where it would release control of at least some of those islands and features. It's also continued to listen to people like me who would urge it in its own interest to consider these kinds of steps. Now, I also believe that it serves U.S. interests to urge China to reverse its SCS actions. Dealing with China constructively at this time is really very difficult. And ironically, the stronger the case that China has blundered by doing what it did in the SCS, the more determined some U.S. officials are to avoid helping China undo its error. Why not keep China in the international doghouse? That's essentially what some people believe, rather than helping it avoid the continuing erosion of its credibility and the goodwill of its neighbors. And who wants to pay the political price for working on a deal that enables China to disregard the LOS award? Now, these difficulties reflect existing realities, but the interests of the United States go beyond exploiting the blunders of its competitors. The U.S. has strong reasons for supporting an effort to convince China to reverse its SCS actions. First, China's control and militarization of this disputed SCS area is its most dangerous international action in recent history, reflecting, I believe, China's growing power and ambition. China's apparent success could lead it to take control of and militarize other disputed SCS territory, or to interfere with trade routes, or even to consider breaching its understandings regarding Taiwan. The U.S. has a strong interest in precluding that kind of development. Supporting a diplomatic outcome that would enable China to preserve its SCS claims reflects reality, not weakness. Securing a reversal of China's actions would restore the rights of both China and the Philippines to advance their legal positions. Now, continued reliance on freedom of navigation operations is also not in the U.S. interest. These are risky, expensive measures and could lead to escalations. The economic cost of maintaining U.S. influence in Southeast Asia has also gone up as a result of these activities. And it is much more safe and less expensive to deal with a China that is committed to securing mutually acceptable resolutions of competing claims than willing to use force to advance its ambitions. Now, the U.S. does not regard itself as obliged by treaty to use force against China's seizure of SCS features within the Philippine EEZ. But the treaty's objectives support a U.S. role in encouraging China to reverse its conduct and to engage the Philippines in a renewed effort to reach agreements on sovereignty or joint management. Finally, U.S. practice and interests are also consistent with a joint declaration with China and other like-minded states to insist upon the power to determine the scope of their UNCLOS reservations. And the third aspect of my talk is the consistency of such a declaration with international law. Truly consensual adjudication is a valuable tool in the development and application of international law, but in ratifying UNCLOS, China never contemplated that it had agreed its SCS claims would be subject to the decision of LOS tribunals. The declaration would protect the established principle that sovereign states are entitled to insist on the consensual adjudication of international disputes. Now, ensuring truly consensual adjudication will actually help states who are worried about tribunals taking jurisdiction without justification in many of these cases. And that includes the U.S. and its failure to ratify UNCLOS, which is partly based on this concern. So just encouraging the U.S. to ratify UNCLOS, I think, is an advance, would be an advance in international law and the development of the law of the sea. The change would not be anywhere near as significant as some people claim. There are only 25 states or so who have actually invoked this reservation of the 160 that have ratified UNCLOS. And it is very unlikely that any state that has ratified the treaty on the basis of that restraint would agree to allow itself to be subjected to a tribunal that is using the kind of artificial reasoning that was used in order to bring China under the tribunal's control. So, also, this is sort of a crazy idea that you could somehow undermine international law if you could convince China to do this, to withdraw from this area in exchange for the power to define its reservations. The withdrawal from this area would be a tremendous service to international law and order and peace and security. Whereas this issue of who defines the scope of a reservation in UNCLOS is a relatively minor issue at best compared to the reversal of this very, very concerning development. So the absolute end of freedom of navigation operations would also be an advance in terms of international law, and this would result because China would no longer be claiming that all this territory and water was its sovereign property, and the U.S. would no longer need to engage in such operations. Now, I know that success is never certain in any major diplomatic initiative, of course, and neither country now is ready to negotiate a plan of the complexity that I've suggested. But the stakes are high, and the failure to resolve this continuing dispute could lead to additional confrontations, dangerous uses of force, and ultimately to a radical change in China's strategic posture. The notion that China should accept the LOS award is viewed by China as an effort to embarrass rather than to persuade. China does not shame easily. It knows the U.S. has not ratified UNCLOS. It believes, with good reason, that the U.S. would have disapproved an LOS tribunal's decision to take jurisdiction over claims similar to those brought against China. Any viable proposal, therefore, to undo the consequences of China's SCS actions must also undo the lawfare strategy of using non-consensual litigation to resolve conflicting SCS sovereignty-related claims. Achieving such a result would advance the interests of all affected states as well as of international law, peace, and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Abe, for a very substantive and constructive approach to what has been a very vexing set of problems in the South China Sea. Now, we now turn to Shending Li, who can bring us perspective from his perch in Shanghai.
My gratitude to Dr. Wu Shichun and Dr. Hong Nong. We are discussing about the risk of strategic competition. Lots of competition on trade, making new international law, on not observing international law, on space, on cyber, on intellectual property rights, on maritime rights, etc. I would say competition is natural. People in the room compete. Even they work for the same organization, they could still compete. A nation compete for ages. So it's desirable to cooperate, but I think competition is more common than cooperation. Why cooperation? To increase public goods or to avoid a nasty competition. So I'm going to present my argument. What if competition would be unavoidable? What kind of competition we may feel desirable? I'm not against competition. I think we should nurture a good habit of constructive, proactive, cooperative competition. First, trade. Over the last year, especially over the year since CICAS last annual meeting, China and U.S. have waged certain kind of nasty, if not bloody, trade competition. I don't feel bad because U.S. want China to make a progress. That's why U.S. encouraged China to join WTO. U.S. want China to be integrated into the world. But somehow U.S. may think by now China has made too much progress. China is leading in 5G, in some of the AI, artificial intelligence, and in fast rail, in quantum calculation, and in quantum coded encryption, etc. So U.S. is no longer dominant in all these. Sometimes U.S. is lagging behind. So the cooperation has led to an undesirable competition situation for America. So America needs to redefine competition to increase its esteem in order to lead again. I don't think the U.S. motivation is difficult to understand. If China is clean, is decent, then I would defend my country. If China has some nasty things to do, has been leading in a cheating, thefting way, as a Chinese, I would defend America. But I don't know what China has done. I would feel desirable if the US would go to WTO, because we have instrument, we have machine, we have the law that the US has generated for everybody to follow. The WTO arbitrary system. And actually, President Obama has gone there to sue China in 2016 for China's possible over-subsidizing of some of its industry and export. U.S. won some of its suing against China 3 years later, only too late. That may not help the Democrats. So you see, we do have commonly agreed framework that China is willing to join because it benefits China. The process is so long. China has 3 years to improve. So China is willing to stay there. But the US considers that US would never imagine the process would be so bureaucratic. So this administration is very much unwilling to pursue that approach. It's more interested in unilateralism, picking China, just having one-on-one negotiation or one-sided sanction. I understand, because the system has problem. But could we work together to improve the system? US is unwilling. So let me say, China should have self-criticism. If I indeed committed in over-subsidizing, China should apologize and may give some compensation. But meantime, China and US should work together to redefine the system to reduce its bureaucracy. That would make the US to be still interested in sticking to its own system that it has hard generated. Don't push the US to leave. It would hurt America. It would hurt us. But how to keep Americans there, China should be more proactive. In working with the WTO, in shortening the process to make a ruling. So this is how I feel. I don't think the trade war is necessarily bad. It is a rebalancing, refixing, redefining process to make a better WTO. And we are moving towards that direction. WTO never disallow bilateral talk. But once China and US may very much possibly reach an agreement, even for a short-term interim agreement, how we can extend this to the entire WTO. Whatever China would unilaterally committed to the US through bilateral talk may extend to all other WTO partners, because China cares multilateralism. So China would not only extend a rebalanced outcome to America, but to the entire world. Like China's People's Congress just made a new law, foreign investment law, that committed itself to all international partners that their investment in China from now on would not be contingent on the enforced transfer of technology with their potential Chinese counterparts. And China may not demand them to find a counterpart. For many sectors, China would be more open, allowing foreign business to invest as a whole and owned enterprises. Without Trump's harsh policy, China may never commit to this. But with this new policy, improved policy, China may lose some business now, but China may win the heart of America and the entire world. And over a discourse of 5 to 10 years, China may be back again, more competent, in a more balanced and equal way. This is what I want to send my message. Don't feel the current strategic competition is bad. It may be a necessary process to rebalance the two countries. So America needs to get what it deserves, and China may not get some of what it has already gained. And China would come back to be more competent in compliance with all international rules it has already subscribed. If we don't have such a rule, let's make through civic way, through civility, through smile, talk, negotiation. And this is what President Xi Jinping and his team, led by Liu He, and the White House, this White House, are working on. They may not achieve success, but that may not mean they failed, because they succeed probably in 90% of the items they are discussing. So I would think this is a huge cooperation in the name of competition. And the same spirit can extend to many other areas. Space. U.S. used to think China is a small actor. China wants to send its astronauts to do experiment in the U.S.-led International Space Station. The White House may be interested, but the House refused. Now China is going to launch its own full-scale space station from this year to 2022. And over time, we may welcome American astronauts to board Chinese space station for cooperation. So time would change. The more the U.S. would restrict China's development. China has to seek its own self-reliant approach. U.S. may think China may have conducted some espionage to steal American know-how. China may do. China may be criticized. China may pay a fine. China loses some of its international credit. But over time, China would more respect the international credit. China's leadership in fast rail, in 5G, could also be under threat by other nations. So over time, China may have its own impetus, its homegrown need to protect its intellectual property rights. And our two countries may grow more common interest, how we may lead together to protect our mutual intellectual property rights and to generate the next generation international instruments that other countries may join. From space to career, President Xi Jinping met North Korean leader 4 times. U.S. had a suspicion. What are you talking about? Could we talk to U.S. before we talk to North Korea? Could we debrief with the U.S. soon after our meeting with North Korea to avoid unnecessary suspicion? Of course, even you talk to U.S. may still suspect you, but that's better than not to talk to U.S. or talk to U.S. too late. I think there are many ways. If we have heart, we have skill, we have good diplomats, we would use peaceful means. We would use our lip service to remove unnecessary potential harm. And North Korea, in my personal view, would never abandon nuclear weapon. I mean, it's the last piece of nuclear weapon. But it is still possible to abandon 90% of the nuclear weapon they already acquired. They may abandon while building more secretive program. But how to bring them into the process in the hope of seeking perfection of denuclearization, but being pragmatic. Reducing one piece is politically good and is physically better than reducing nothing. We should not use a perfect objective to prevent us from achieving some limited pragmatic reduction of threat. China's philosophy seems to be good, but how to make it workable with the US and with North Korea, with South Korea? We have a lot of common interest. If we fail to talk, we may only help to grow more suspicion. If we talk, we may still not be able to remove such a suspicion. But certainly we have less chance to plant more seed of discord. This is how I view turning nasty competition to good competition, healthy competition. And we can use this in South China Sea. President Xi Jinping promised to President Obama, to what the US press reports, that China is not going to militarize those artificial rocks. But then the two countries need to catch up, talk, negotiate. What defines militarization? What category of hardware? And how many pieces? Under what circumstances? China, Japan have already turned the nasty strategic competition over East China Sea to ordered competition and certain cooperation. They have made East China Sea, sea and air avoidance of confidence. And this should be picked up by China and the US to work out how China, US, when two ships would be close, when two airplanes would be close, the captain should talk in English or in Chinese without reporting to their immediate boss how to avoid a disaster like an EP3 collision, how to help build military trust. We may never imagine China to withdraw from SCS in those disputed rocks. But at least we should avoid, it's our duty to avoid military confrontation. We may not be able to resolve our difference over Taiwan Islands in short term, but we should have more political arrangement. Distrust should not escalate. So if we can use this philosophy and spirit, don't necessarily see competition is nasty, and have our heart, genuine heart, to turn competition into healthy and constructive mode. Then I'm sure we are going to have a peaceful, sustainable, prosperous regional order. Good for everybody. Once again, my thanks to ICAS and to Paul, our chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ding Li. You've continued the tradition of Shanghai moderation in the face of severe policies from Beijing, and we want to explore that further as we go on. But we are now ready to jump to the most important new test of this kind of call for moderation and accommodation in the upcoming bilateral, or the ongoing bilateral trade talks. And Erin Ennis will have her views to present.
Good morning. Hopefully I live up to the hype. I should note for everyone that I've got a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief. That might benefit all of you. But I think actually there's a few things that we can talk about on the trade and investment side that, as you'll note from my characterization of my remarks, I view this both as risks and opportunities. So I'm going to start with the risk side of the equation. I might as well keep the theme going on that side. But I'd like to continue with some things that I think might be a little more useful. When you talk about the trade and economic relationship between the United States and China, I think it is important for all of us to remember why this matters. And the number one reason, at least from the US business community's point of view, is China is a massive market. I think we lose sight of exactly how big it is, but it is driving the growth of the vast majority of American companies that are doing business in China. And despite the challenges that have come up in the past couple of years, it is still outpacing growth for almost every other market in the world for American companies. Now, that is the basis of why the business community cares so much. It's also a basis of a reason why the United States should care enough about all of this. The flip side is true as well. America has become a massive market for Chinese companies. And while the data that came out of 2018 didn't indicate that the tariff battles between the two countries had yet to genuinely have an effect on China's economy, there is certainly a chill that's going on both sides and a significant level of concern for companies on both sides of the Pacific about what happens if the two sides don't reach agreement. There is, of course, no answer to that yet, and that contributes to a significant level of uncertainty and the kinds of questions that American companies are concerned about when they are trying to make plans and understand where their growth opportunities will be coming from in the future. Second, I think it is important to also note that where we are right now in the trade and economic relationship is not because of a misunderstanding. It's not because of baseless accusations. There are numerous ongoing problems in how China's economy functions for foreign companies. Now, that does include intellectual property rights, market access issues, but it also gets down to just the basic differences of how foreign companies are treated in the market versus domestic companies. Now, you could add to that, there's obviously clearly some distortions in the market about how Chinese privately owned companies function versus state-owned enterprises as well. But all of this contributes to a circumstance in which part of the reason why, despite the very strong concerns that the American business community has had about the use of tariffs and many of the tactics that the Trump administration has used to address trade issues, there still remains a fundamental support for the issues that the administration is seeking to address. There is, I would say, a somewhat high pain threshold at this point of the tolerance for how much the American business community is willing to endure if it feels that we're moving towards a solution that could genuinely address some of these problems. It's unclear right now exactly how many of those problems might be addressed. For any of you who spent your careers in government, I'm sure you can appreciate the fact that no agreement will address everyone's problems. I think someone told me recently that the best test of an agreement is that everyone's a little bit unhappy. And so hopefully that is the solution we will get to in these current negotiations. I think the third thing to keep in mind in the context of the rest of my comments is that, at least in the United States, we have always had a balance between our military and security interests and our trade and economic interests. Finding that balance has led to us to genuinely allow our market to be open to foreign investment, largely regardless of who that investor is. It has encouraged us to go out and seek new markets for companies, even if that access to other markets was not reciprocal, because of the reality that having a strong economic basis for the United States economy is important to ensuring not just our economic security, but that broader national security. Now, Where we are right now, I would say, in the United States, seems to suggest that right now, those two issues are out of balance. Military and security issues seem to prevail. It is among the reasons why frequently when many of us talk about these issues and seek to come up with compromise issues that will address both the concerns of American companies, but also the legitimate criticisms of what's going on in the United States, that some of those recommendations are dismissed. But that has to be the balance of where we get back if we hope to have a sustainable solution on any of the trade and economic issues. And frankly, if we want to maintain the long-term economic prospects for the United States as well as for the economies around the world. So with that context, let me just note a couple of the risks that I think we are facing right now in the competition between the United States and China in trade and investment. But then I'll also note a few opportunities. I would say the number one risk that I feel is important that we put out there is that while there has been a fair amount of discussion in Washington for the past year or so about this idea of decoupling the US and Chinese economies, it's a really interesting intellectual discussion point, but it is entirely unrealistic when you consider the fact that the US has a globally integrated economy and American companies that not only depend on that global integration to be competitive globally, but to also be a better competitor than their counterparts from other countries. If the United States were to move towards policies that cuts off legitimate trade and investment, while our other major trading partners do not, we will not only fail to address whatever the concerns might have driven us to think that we wanted to decouple the economies, but we're also going to undermine American companies, American innovation, and American growth. I hope that that risk is too high for us to genuinely pursue, but until we can debunk the myth that decoupling is a realistic option, I think we all have to continue to talk about the fact that it is not the desirable outcome for any of us. Second, I think we also need to understand that the current path that the United States is on, not just with China, but also with most of our other trading partners, in using tariffs as a way to address the concerns of our economy, are ones that are a losing tactic in the long term, and certainly even in the short term. The U.S. China Business Council each year puts out a report on U.S. exports to China by state and by congressional district. I'm sure it will surprise none of you that exports from our agriculture regions and other areas of the country were off dramatically last year. China is the fastest growing economy in the world, and that the U.S. was losing market share in this. If we think that tariffs are going to somehow force China to the table, we have to be willing to accept the fact that it's going to come at a significant cost to the U.S. economy. And the better approach to any of these issues is to potentially use tariffs in the way the administration has as a short-term means to focus everyone's attention on what needs to get done. But any solution that comes out of that has got to have a plan of action to remove those tariffs entirely, rather than thinking that tariffs either make us more competitive against Chinese imports, or the idea that I have heard bandied about somewhat recently, that somehow tariffs are compensation for the United States for all of the lost opportunity we've had over the years. I can assure you that tariffs are a terrible reparations policy, and I don't know that any reparations policy would have made sense in this context. Now, all of this, of course, will come at not the benefit of just Chinese companies, but will come at the benefit of our other trading partners as well. It's among the reasons why we have argued since the beginning that any solution that comes out of these issues cannot be just bilateral, even though we are the two largest economies in the world. It has to be done in concert with all of our trading partners. As several of my fellow panelists have noted, when we act in concert to actually improve the global system, everyone benefits from it. And again, if everyone is a little bit unhappy with the outcome, that wouldn't be bad. That would actually benefit us. We cannot allow the World Trade Organization to no longer be viable because of a battle between the United States and China, or simply because of concerns of one member of the WTO. We have had the global growth and opportunity that we have seen over the last 20 years, thanks to the WTO, not in spite of it. So let me note a few things that I think are the basic opportunities that should be obvious to all of us, but that I think are warranted to note as well. The first one is competition is good for business. So if we are talking about a level playing field, American companies and Chinese companies, I suspect as well, will be fully open to the idea that allowing more competition will benefit everyone. There will be winners and there will be losers, and they may not be the ones that we would pick on our own if we had choices. But that's part of the benefit of the global trading economy, is allowing the market and consumers to make those decisions rather than trying to dictate or mandate which industries are going to be the winners and losers. Second, something that I think we lose sight of in the United States frequently because of our size is how essential foreign investment is to growth of both the U.S. and the Chinese economy. It creates jobs, it creates wealth, it is something that enables us to continue to innovate by bringing in new thoughts and new innovative ideas, and that is what strengthens companies, not the support of the government, and certainly not the protection of a government from that competition. Meaningful challenges to the issues that foreign companies have been dealing with in China that result in substantive changes to those things are going to benefit not just the foreign companies that do business there, but to Chinese companies will benefit as well. And that should be something that we should all be seeking to pursue. Finally, let me know that while I think it's obvious that the US and China are going to remain the largest economies in the world, we have got to get back to finding ways that we can cooperate on trade and economic issues that will benefit the global economy. There's no shortage of issues to be worked on at this point. Certainly WTO reform should be near the top of that list, and whether it is proposals that individual countries put on the table or groups of countries table to try to seek the solutions that will reach a consensus among the trading partners, we cannot ignore those, and it needs to be done in ways that both the US and China agree to. But there's other issues that clearly we could benefit from as well in working directly with China. We should go back to what the work we were doing was on climate change. On issues where the United States seems to have backed away from what our top concerns are, it will focus all of our attention in the near future if we don't find ways to work together on it. And ultimately, when dealing with any trade and economic issues, we should recognize that amongst those winners and losers in all economies around the world will be some workers and some industries where, frankly, they will simply not be competitive any longer. We have yet to have a worthwhile discussion, both domestically here in the United States, but frankly, it's one that every country in the world deals with, about how we transition our workforces to be able to benefit from those innovations that we want to see, be it 5G, be it the climate change new industries that will come up. Finding ways to transition those workforces so that all countries, but the United States and China in particular, have the kind of social stability that we all crave is something that I suspect we could find some solutions on if we were to seek to work on them together. I'm going to stop there and save my voice for the questions, but thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Aaron, for a very crisp and realistic presentation. I think a lot of what you've been adumbrating will come to focus in the G20 meeting this coming June in Osaka, and we'll see WTO reform, the U.S. China trade imbroglio, and other matters addressed, hopefully constructively at that time. You know, listening to the panelists, I'm not going to engage in interaction up here on the stage because time is short. I came away with two aphorisms in mind from what the collection of remarks has presented. The first is seek truth from facts, a Chinese aphorism. And the second is use lemons but make lemonade, a Western aphorism. And try to make the best of something when the situation is kind of sour to begin with. And I think this kind of hunt for realism is very important. This morning we heard remarks about the National Security Strategy Report, the Taiwan Relations Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, high-minded efforts to change the structure of U.S. relations with Taiwan beyond what was initially envisioned. The fact is none of that has happened. The United States has not sent cabinet members to Taiwan. They've not celebrated things that China feared would be celebrated. The U.S. has not done anything to break out of the very deterrent or oriented efforts to keep Taiwan from sinking militarily, not to provoke or to cause offensive capabilities to change the situation across the Taiwan Strait. The National Security Strategy Report recently was described by National Security Advisor John Bolton in an interview in the Atlantic Monthly as something he put in a drawer because he thinks he is not running a think tank. The people in China's side ascribe great importance to this document. The author of the National Security Report and her supervisor, H.R. McMasters, and the author were asked not long ago, what is a revisionist power now that we call China a revisionist power? And they were unable to identify it. So you got to dig into the facts. And I think on the other side, it's a similar situation. We have people preaching against the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a big focus in China this week, as a debt trap. And they uniformly and singularly record what happened in Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka took too much money from China, ended up in debt, and had to convert a port into a 99-year lease to China. Well, one, it was before the Belt and Road Initiative, had nothing to do with it. Two, it was initiated by the Sri Lankan side by a highly corrupt leader in the country trying to feather his home nest. And three, it's left China with a white elephant that they can't do anything with. So look at the facts, not just engage in the rhetoric. China has been changing the rules on Belt and Road to make them more transparent, to raise the standards criteria for lending. And we ought to look at these facts and not simply put labels on them, march around continents warning people about things. We're damaging our own credibility by being remote from the facts. Now, that's my little piping off before I turn to questions from the floor. We have about 10 minutes. If you do have a question or a point of view to express, please make it brief. And when you raise your hand to get attention, raise it high and move a lot because the lighting is really bad. It's quite hard to see any interest out there. Way in the back of the room toward the entrance to the coffee shop, I see. Are there microphones? Yeah, way back there. Sorry if it's too far away. You got a question? We'll come back to you.
Todd Thurwachter with the U.S. China Foundation for Exchange and Development. I'm curious, having served in China as a commercial officer and very concerned about IPR, back in the 80s and 90s, and even until today, until recently when you could do when you could invest without a joint venture, the only way to get in was negotiating against China Incorporated, which meant there were the same terms for everyone. You could pick any partner you wanted for a joint venture partner, but they all required you to transfer your technology. And of course, then we have the cybercrime area. Why would we take on, the companies who had their IPR plucked and their their know-how and their trade secrets plucked, they know who benefited. And yet, why would we then address that problem with blunt tariffs rather than surgically going against those specific companies and industries? And why wouldn't we work with the Europeans and the other countries who have the same problems?
Okay, thank you very much. I think do you want to take that one on, Aaron? Yeah, I'll be happy to join with it.
Sure. All I can tell you is it's not that we haven't suggested that, but this is the path that the administration went. When it comes right down to it, we are at the point here where it literally is just an intellectual debate about which would have gotten us to get China to the table faster. I will not be dissuaded from the idea that working with our trading partners would have not only gotten us to the table as rapidly, but had a longer-term solution that we could come out of it with. We may have a solution that comes out of these discussions now, but we're now going to have to pull in our trading partners to make sure it's in alignment with their interests as well. But certainly, whatever comes out of that needs to have a removal of those tariffs, which are just distorting what the relationship looks like, not just with China, but certainly with most of our trading partners at this point.
I would point out that in last year, Bob Lighthizer, the United States Trade Representative, did undertake a multinational effort to address some of these issues with Japanese and European trade commissioners. And it had some initial, I mean, he's seen as a guy behind tariffs and all, but he also has a multilateral component. That was very quickly undermined when President Trump, for domestic political reasons, imposed this 232 sanctions on many of our trading partners, and it inhibited cooperation with other partners. It's taken months now to digest that. They're trying to get back to it again for this G20 agenda in June, and that will be, for me, an important test of the commitment of the USTR to a multilateral approach. There's a question here in the front table.
Due to the shortage of time, I'll just ask a question for Judge Sofair. Given that ASEAN has finally reached the stage where it has a draft code of conduct, given what his thoughts were about the U.S. And China being the, frankly, major players in the South China Sea, should that code of conduct include the United States?
Well, I don't think so. I think the U.S. should support the development of a code of conduct. It takes a long time to get it done. I agree with Dr. Wu that it's a very important effort. I think that China's actions in the Philippine exclusive economic zone have created a great deal of anxiety in that process. I think the U.S. can help, Myron. I think the U.S. can help by working with China. But the fact is that the U.S. right now is working with other states to try to consolidate opposition to China. So it's gotten to be a problem. We could be a problem rather than a help there, if our effort is to actually encourage the other states to bring the kind of litigation, let's say the Philippines brought against China, rather than to encourage them to convince China to demonstrate that they really are prepared to apply whatever the principles are that are going to be developed in the Code of Conduct to the Philippines. Because, you know, that's part of it. What they did in reacting to the litigation, the Philippine litigation, I think has fundamentally undermined the potential to develop a code of conduct that will really be accepted and believed, let's say, by Vietnam. So, no, the U.S. shouldn't play a bigger role there than it's appropriate. But yes, we should support. We should try to help China and the other states achieve a code of conduct.
Abe, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is in the current extended discussions on the COC, China is insisting that the other parties agree not to conduct military exercises with third parties, namely us.
Right.
Don't we have a stake in working with our partners in the region who have alliance and other relationships to prevent that kind of element emerging in the final COC?
I don't think it's not going to be hard for us, because the other states are not going to agree to this. The only possibility of their agreeing to anything like that would be if China actually showed it was peace-oriented and would start withdrawing from this area. China cannot exacerbate a situation and then tell its potential partners and appropriate natural allies, hey, don't worry about it. All you have to do is now stop cooperating with the U.S. And the whole field of action right now is the U.S. cooperating with them to strengthen them so that they can oppose China if China attacks them. So that's, you know, and that possibility is real if they actually start bringing lawsuits against China, which is, you know,
isn't there also the case that
astonishing.
It wouldn't necessarily be lawsuits against China. China has indicated its intention to draw straight baselines around the Spratly Island group, which would then incorporate territories occupied effectively by others in the region, and then that could be a casus belli in the region.
Yeah, I mean, the straight line thing is something that China just has to get beyond. It doesn't have any basis in international law. But let's do it together. Let's not go to some tribunal where we haven't even agreed to do that and work it out. So there needs to be a process started that will back away from these things. China is trying to, right now, intimidate its partners in the COC into accepting this notion that they cannot engage in military activities with the one state that's prepared to help them prevent the kind of thing China has done to the Philippines. And it's just unrealistic to think that all of those states will agree to that. So the COC is dead in the water if that's going to be a real condition.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I see one back here.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Just to follow up a little bit on the question about joint military operations between ASEAN countries and the United States, there are some reports saying a ASEAN-U.S. military operation or exercise may take place in September this year. Would you, or any of the panelists, would you expect such an exercise to be more symbolic or more substantial? And do you think such actions will be viewed as a provocation that might destabilize the region? Thanks.
Michael, if you know something. I don't know about the story. So
well, I don't have any inside information on this, but I would think it would be quite a lift for the ASEAN states to agree to exercise with the United States in the South China Sea to show, in effect, to show defiance against China. I mean, it would not help the situation. But I think that impetus for that is probably coming almost entirely from the U.S. And you know, the mindset now in Washington is fundamentally deterrence-oriented. You just have to do more to deter China. And there's no evidence or very little evidence of the kind of elements of reassurance that Abe and others and myself have been talking about, which is not appeasement. It means you have to get to some realistic understanding here about limits. Before you can even get to a point where you're contemplating the idea of China modifying its position, you have to put a stop on the escalatory dynamic which is currently underway.
Just to wrap this up, I could make comments about Chinese strengths and weaknesses in diplomacy and the like, but that's for Chinese to worry about. As an American, I'm very concerned about the deterioration of our diplomatic capabilities, the deprofessionalization of ambassadors, things like that that are long-term trends that haven't been the best. And a good example of that for me is that we have so quickly got into the military escalatory cycle on the South China Sea without contemplating alternative means to getting to solutions. And a couple of people have remarked on fisheries here. I think if the U.S. had an initiative with other like-minded parties on how to conserve marine proteins in the South China Sea when they're being depleted around the world, that would have a knock-on effect on the military competition as well, because we would have to get to the problem of what militarization does to seabeds and what having fishermen guarding territory does for fish resources in the South China Sea. And that's just one example. I can think of others as well, where a more civilian, less militarized, common approach might lead us to more sustainable outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel for the opening discussion.